Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today will be Seabass of WNWS in Jackson, Tennessee. We will take questions from the mailbag, primarily around the Vanderbilt hire of Coach Jerry Stackhouse for its basketball program. Our show is sponsored by the Well Coffee House, which turns coffee into water. The Well is a coffee house with a mission to bring clean water to the world. To date, over 30 communities across the globe have access to safe water, health, and hope. You too can make an impact by visiting a Well Coffee House location today. There are 5 to serve you in the Nashville area: Brentwood, Green Hills, downtown, Bellevue, and the Cool Springs Lifeway. More information can be found at wellcoffeehouse.org. The Well Coffee House, where coffee changes lives. We also thank our co-sponsor, Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center, which is located in the Gulch. Our news today presented by Sutherland and Belk, a local injury law firm committed to helping those who've been injured in accidents. If you or someone you know has been in a wreck or other accident, reach out to Sutherland and Belk, see what your rights are. You can find all their contact info online at sbinjurylaw.com. Vanderbilt and Arkansas have a 3-game baseball series this weekend starting Friday night at Hawkins Field. Vanderbilt 2 games behind Georgia in the SEC East, and probably more importantly, number 2 nationally in the RPI, which is what the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee uses to select and seed the NCAA baseball tournament. Our buddy Seabass of WNWS in Jackson, Tennessee joins us for an abbreviated version of the podcast today, as I've got to take my kids somewhere tonight. Thank you for joining us, my friend. How have you been?
Man, I'm doing great. You homeless flamingo. What you doing?
Just managing time. It is flying by. When I tell you, when you have a coaching search, it just consumes everything. So I'm trying to learn the normal again, if that makes sense.
No question about it, man. I'm ready to rock if you are.
Well, let's go straight into the mailbag, which is sponsored by Vanderbilt fan and independent insurance agent Josh Minton of Brentwood. Do you need an insurance agent who wants to know your unique needs and circumstances and will tailor an insurance plan to fit them? Josh is your guy. Call him 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/JD Minton HQ. He's my insurance agent. Give him a shot and you'll be pleased. Okay, let's start with the big topic from Ann Arbor Door. Does Bass back Stack?
Yeah, Bass back Stack. He's got to. I mean, I got no choice, Chris. My other option is to say, forget it. I'm done, and I'm not prepared to do that. I mean, obviously there's a ton of questions regarding this, so we don't know who the assistants are going to be unless you know something I don't. But yeah, man, I'm excited. I've liked some of the things I've heard so far. He seems like a guy who's ready to get after it. Now, the one thing that I will say to you, and I'm sure you kind of ascertained the same thing by what you've heard so far, is if nothing else, Jerry Stackhouse is extremely confident in his ability to do this job. And I think that's important, by the way.
Oh, I agree. I hope he's not a little overconfident. I know one thing that he said caught my eye a little bit. He talked about how he doesn't really need a lot of help with X's and O's. I'm like, well, and I don't mean this as a derogatory take on him. I want it to work out. Everything I hear about him is pretty good, but I'm like, boy, you're up against guys in the league that have been head coaches for 30 years. So that's the part I do wonder about a little bit.
Yeah, no doubt. But what is Coach Mason? Remember what Coach Mason had to say? And you remember what he said? Can't talk about it, can't be about it. However you want to subscribe to that, that's fine. I mean, and I feel you. I mean, I agree. There's this league is chock full of fantastic coaches with potentially more on the way. So he's got his work cut out for him, but I mean, the guy knows everybody. The connections are obviously there. As the guy who's played against the greatest in the world for nearly 20 years, had early success as a G League coach. And it's, I was listening to some Grizzlies talk yesterday, and they were saying that they credited Stackhouse with the development of some of the young players on that team. So, I mean, again, that's not being an SEC head basketball coach, and I'm well aware of that. But, the things that he has done so far, he's seen early success.
The two things that I can say with confidence about him, I think that they'll really get after it, which they needed that. I think they'll probably build in some toughness they didn't have. And I think in terms of publicity, it's been a really good hire for them so far.
Yeah. I mean, I would say this, outside of getting something like a Greg Marshall or something like that, just an established, big-time, well-thought-of coach like that. As far as outside of the box hires goes, I mean, I don't really see how they could have done any better. Of course, my whole stance about, winning a press conference is irrelevant. I mean, it is, but it's fun to hear the way the guy talks, but it's about getting the job done at the end of the day. And whatever the situation is, he's got a lot of work ahead of him, and it's time to get right to it. And one of those first things will be to put that staff together. And I was kind of hoping that we might know who that staff is by now, but I can't imagine it's going to be much longer.
Ann Arbor Door also had a question for me about the Austin Crowley decommitment, asked me what I made of it and whether he got cold feet after last year's disastrous season. I've not heard that, but the thing that I've said all along, and I believe I've said this on this podcast probably with you, is don't underestimate the degree to which a lot of those recruits and old players were tied to him. Now, I'm not saying they made a bad move to make a change, but that was one thing that came with the territory is those kids and those recruits love Bryce Drew and that staff. So I think it's probably that is much or more than anything.
Well, and that may be true, and it is true, but that's the case for every school in the country that makes a move like this.
Yeah, you have to do it at some point. I mean, if it's not this year and it's next year, then you have to go through that with those commits. So really, I think that part of it, unless you have an unusually good recruiting class like they had last year, then it's kind of immaterial. And even they had the best recruiting class they've ever had last year, and we know that story. So,
right. Well, and not only that, I mean, we're talking about Austin Crowley, not Darius Garland.
Right.
But the other thing is Crowley didn't decommit until they fired Bryce Drew. It didn't have anything to do with the season. It just didn't.
That's my point.
As a matter of fact, I remember him tweeting out a little while back, basically saying, help's on the way, things are going to turn around, and this was after the disastrous season. So yeah, the result of the record-wise had probably very little to do with Crowley decommitment. What I am a little bit surprised at is that that just tells me that it was all about Bryce Drew, because it sounds like he's not even willing to listen. And that's not even to say that Jerry Stackhouse is going after him. Just it sounds like that from reading what David said, that's really not a probability, that looks like he's moving on, which is fine.
Well, the faith-based approach to that program was the thing that drew a lot of the kids there. And I think he was one of those. He was at Sunrise Christian. So it was interesting in Jerry Stackhouse's press conference, he mentioned God and Bible study in church and things like that being important to him, just kind of out of the blue. I thought, well, that's probably a message aimed at a few kids.
Well, and I mean, now I have no idea about this. I've never heard of that being the case, but is that something that Kermit Davis is well known for? Because I know that Ole Miss looks to be at least the favorite at this point right now. So is that something that Kermit Davis was known for at Middle?
Not that I know of, but that's also his home state. So maybe that had a lot to do with it. Maybe the fact that he was close to home was the thing that's important at that point. So
good luck to Austin, whatever he does, man, except when they play Commodores.
Okay. VU Matt 23 asks, when should we expect to hear anything about Stackhouse's staff?
Chris?
Yeah, did you hear me?
Yeah, I'm saying Chris.
Oh, you're asking me. I don't think they've set a deadline. I would think that names could start coming out in the next couple of days. I mean, you don't want to go too long without having a staff. Maybe you can get a couple and wait longer on the third. But you got to recruit at some point, so you want to get the right guys. And here's the thing about Vanderbilt that we know. Sometimes they can have the guy, but it's not announced for a while because it can take a couple weeks to go through HR and all that stuff. So I would hope they would have that expedited because this is a really key time for them.
No doubt. Yeah, and you're right. Sometimes with us, that process takes, I wouldn't say seemingly, I think it just does take longer with us. I'm not saying don't do all the things that you normally do, but expedite this process a little bit because you're right. It's the first stages of April. This is a very critical time for basketball programs, especially when you're completely rebuilding one.
Good question from Macho Man Vandy Savage. What makes you more excited, Stackhouse's hire as coach or Malcolm Turner's comments about the improvements to athletic facilities?
Oh, that's easy. The improvements to athletic facilities, because that's gonna be a major benefit to Stackhouse or whoever the case may be. You know, whether he works out or he doesn't, this is going to be something that's going to be, of course, depending on the degree of it, that's going to have far-reaching ramifications, for positive ones for this program. I'd tend to say regardless of who the coach is, that obviously matters. But as much as I'm excited about Coach Stackhouse, facilities improvement is A1 to me right now.
Bumac says, what do you deem to be a success for the 2019-20 season and then 2021?
Oh, that's a great question. It's close to impossible to answer because we just don't know who the personnel is going to be for this season or 2021, especially 2021. Look, I don't expect to win 20 games next year. I don't. But what I want to see is a team that exudes what Coach Stackhouse is talking about. You're going to have to kill us to beat us. We're going to be in your face, intensity all night long. We're not going to set up for stupid and lazy mistakes. We'll make mistakes, but we'll learn from them, and you're going to know we were there. You know, if this team does that and just sniffs 500 basketball, and shows me the type of mental toughness and intensity that I think is going to be required to win in this conference going forward, I'd be all right with that. As far as 2021, I can't even get there yet, Chris, because, we have like half of a roster right now. So that's very difficult to answer. And we don't know who our assistants are.
Yeah, I want to answer that by saying I have no expectations for next season and maybe get to the NIT 2021, but I don't even know if that's fair. I mean, this is potentially a really massive rebuild. And that's why, again, I think it's so important for them to get assistants hired and get them recruiting and then get expedited answers on transfers and kids that this staff gets in after, because if you don't get that stuff, man, it could be ugly for 3 or 4 years potentially.
Well, it could, but let me say this. The fun part about basketball is, as opposed to some of the other sports, is, and don't get me wrong, I'm aware of the depth of this conference and how tough it is. But let's say that an Aaron Neesmith really continues to propel himself to being one of the best players in the country, or at least one of the best players in the SEC, who can go out there and get you 20 points a night, and he learns from Stack, and you surround him with a piece or two. And then all of a sudden, that rebuild, and it's still a rebuild, don't get me wrong, but rebuilds in something like basketball, if you can get one or two really good players, that can expedite that process much quicker than, let's say, a football rebuild.
Yeah, but let me ask you this. Is it easier to keep a Neesmith around if you have other pieces? Or in his case, is it maybe harder if it's the current situation, because Neesmith's a stud. People know it. The NBA knows it. Do you want to really stick around if you can get paid to play rather than maybe win 11, 12 games?
I think that's where a guy like Stack could come in. First of all, I think if he can, I think Stack could potentially be the perfect guy for Neesmith. As far as the rolling out early, I get that, and that's certainly a valid point. And I don't really know how you counter it. Not that I'm trying to, but if he gets to that, if he does that, if he becomes that type of player after, let's say, this year, then some things probably went pretty right, not just for him, then we started showing signs of improvement, and we can build through that with recruiting. If we lose him, we lose him, and that happens, and I understand that. That's one of the downsides to the argument that I was just making. But you know what? I'm willing to take that chance, Chris.
I keep thinking back to this. We just always overestimate what we know. I think back to Media Day at SEC Basketball Days 2 years ago. Tennessee gets picked last, wins the conference, and is really kind of become a juggernaut. Maybe not in the way of postseason play, but 2 outstanding seasons in a row. Ole Miss Everybody had pegged the worst program in the conference. The Rebels make the NCAA tournament, had a really good year. Now, I think those were different situations. Those teams had a base where they had sophomores and juniors to build around. I guess you could say Vanderbilt has one with Saban Lee and Aaron Nesmith. That'd be a sophomore, junior. Both those guys are back. So maybe it's more similar than I think, but the league's also a lot tougher now, too. I think that those teams had more supporting parts that worked, especially Tennessee. Maybe not Ole Miss as much. Ole Miss was very backcourt heavy with Tyree, but Tennessee had Bone and Bowden and those guys. I don't know that Vanderbilt's got enough ancillary pieces around those two, but the point remains, boy, if we can't even figure it out a month or two before the season, or 4 or 5 months before the end of the season, as that turned out, then it's really hard to size them up right now. But the thing that's different is they've just got such an uphill climb because there's so many unknowns with kids in the transfer portal and stuff like that. So anyway.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, in regards to that portal, would really love to see Stack be able to talk Yanni out of doing that and maybe coming back. And then, one thing which a name we haven't even mentioned in months, obviously he redshirted, but what if Ben has matured? His game has matured a little bit, that's kind of a factor we hadn't really considered, but potentially he could be a decent piece for us next year.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember Will Purdue redshirted and then, becomes SEC Player of the Year after his last 2 years. Sometimes that red shirt you really brings a guy along, but I don't know if they had the development. I wasn't there, but I have to question it because Will Purdue had Ed Martin, who was a big-time, big-man coach. And,
sure.
Obviously we know about the staff's struggles to develop talent. We could have a whole podcast on that, but we won't. So, yeah, just a lot of unknowns. The next question is, what type players do you feel Jerry Stackhouse will recruit, and when can he begin doing so?
Man, I think he's going to try to recruit passionate players. I think. If I'm getting the gist of him and just seeing what he's like beyond his NBA career, I think he's looking for no nonsense cats who are going to get everything they got for 40 minutes. And I think he believes he can coach them up. There may be players who that may not be all 5 stars, but I think players that he can coach up and that will model his intensity and the way that he wants to play the game, have the game played as the head coach. That's what I see when I think about him. I think about the type of players because not everybody can play for just any type of coach. Sometimes it just doesn't work. But he strikes me as a guy, you watch some of the clips of him coaching, he's going to be barking, Chris. You're going to hear him out there. He's going to do his thing. He's going to do what he knows. And I think you're going to have a certain player that's okay with that can take some heavy coaching and criticism. He's going to give you the love, but he's also going to let you know when you screw up. Not everybody can handle that. But I think he's going to look for players who thrive in those type of situations.
I agree with you. The one thing that might be sort of at odds with that is sometimes skill sets are different, and the guy that gets after you and the guy that can really shoot it are two different guys. He's going to have to find a shooter.
Oh, no doubt. No question about that.
Okay, let's see. I got one more question. I'll wrap it up in a minute, but we got about 5 minutes before I've got to go. Anything that you wanted to hit on the Stackhouse hire, on football, on baseball? I'm going to give you the floor for about 5 minutes before I wrap up with the final question.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to send a shout out and do a dedication of this podcast to Dan's mom. Number 2, let's see. Really, it's funny. We had a question from the mailbag the other day asking, who were the most important recruits and position wise. And, last week we were kind of lauding the Ken Seals get, and that was a great get, and hopefully he can help build the class. But what did we say? Offensive lineman. We lose one out of our own backyard to a school that's just like us. That makes me sick. I have a heart. I get it. You fall in love with the school and you want to get away from home. I understand it, but it hurts me when we lose a kid like Graham Barton to a school just like us, a couple states over. Or at least hundreds of miles away. That's really difficult. They needed him, and they had a great shot at him. And then the Wigington kid, the kid out of the Midwest, commits to, I think, Indiana. Then, of course, I think it was the Love kid, the running back, committed to Illinois, which was no surprise. And I think we're going to still be fine there. But losing out on a couple of those linemen, especially Graham Barton, to me was a gut punch.
The Barton thing, you texted me about that. I don't know what his reasoning was or what his thinking was. And I always say this, every kid is different. Graham Barton might have been a kid, for all I know, that loved Vanderbilt, but just wanted to get away from Nashville for 4 years. I don't ever try to take a one-off, oh, this guy did this and this means that, because I used to be in the recruiting business on the academic end, and I know every kid's different. So to make a sweeping judgment like that would be silly. But you and I have noted for a couple of years, they've not really recruited the mid-state well. They had the phenomenal talent potential haul in their backyard last year, and they whiffed on pretty much all the guys that everybody wanted. Now, that had a lot to do with the season. Now, they had more to build on this year coming into this class. I just keep thinking on how kids in the area and out of the area view this program differently. Like if Ken Seals was, say, at Father Ryan, does he commit to Vanderbilt? I don't know, because I go to those games. They're outnumbered in their own backyard. The excitement has not been there. They don't promote the program well enough in a lot of ways. Now, I think some of that's going to change with Malcolm Turner, but hear me out here. You can't tell me that some of that is not a factor.
I'm not saying it's not a factor, but those kids like Ken Seals, they've been to games at Vanderbilt. They already know that.
They don't see it week in and week out. They come for a visit, and you can pass anything off as kind of a one-off thing, if that makes sense.
It does, but, I'll say this to you. When it comes to mid-state recruiting, I mean, I hate we miss Graham Barton, but I will go I will stand up for Coach Mason and the staff that they have definitely made that mid-state area much more of a priority over the last several years, last 2 or 3 years, and they've had success in it, by the way. Not one Smith, but two Smiths, Sheffield, Jawan Williams, Bruno Reagan, Jaden Harrison, Braden DeVault Smith, bringing back Keyshawn. I mean, look, they've done okay in the mid-state area. And they're not going to get everybody. I understand that. But, there's a couple of years ago where it seems like they weren't even looking at it. But, in the last year or two, they've, now 2 years ago, I think the only one they had was Braden DeVault Smith. But, last year you could tell that they really wanted to hit the Nashville area pretty hard. And they've done that. So they have been able to get some guys. And I don't want to get mid-state kids or Tennessee kids just for the sake of doing so. That's not what I'm talking about. But Graham Barton is a perfect fit for Vanderbilt at an absolute position of need. And he's been very high on Vanderbilt for a while. So it just sucks for a Duke to be able to come in and just pluck him away just like that.
Yeah, you're right. And I guess the point I'm trying to make, and this is where I think Malcolm Turner will help them, I would like to see somebody that's going to build more excitement, market the program more, be more aggressive in ticketing, do things like that. You just need more of your fans in the stands. It's just a bad look every time local kids come and they see that.
Well, and I agree with that. But remember something, we are dealing with something that no other school in the SEC has to deal with. We're the only private institution, only one. Every other one are state-funded schools and have so many alumni. I mean, our alumni go all over the world, Chris. And there's just plus our numbers are. I would assume we have the lowest enrollment in the SEC by a good way, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, those are real factors. Not to mention, we have a losing record over decades and decades. Now, we're certainly doing a much better job lately. We can talk about the fact that Coach Mason does not have a winning season, but if you've been a Vanderbilt fan for long enough, I understand James Franklin. I get all that. But if you go back beyond that, the record-wise, Derek Mason is actually one of the winning football coaches in Vanderbilt history. So he's improved things. He's improved the recruiting. And if these facilities come together like they're supposed to, we'll see. I think his job's going to get a little bit easier. But I think that all those things that you said are factors. But, I think that he's done a fine job. I I just hate missing on Barton because we have such a need. Now, Blake Ashmore is a big get, and I think they'll hold on to him. The problem is that we're not in on a whole heck of a lot of difference-making offensive linemen at this point, and the fact is we just need them. Now, I saw a discussion on the board today that said that, one person felt like, well, we've really done bad on the offensive line recruiting, and then somebody else said, no, we haven't, and mentioned his names. But the names they mentioned, some of them are people that really hadn't done much, that could eventually do something, but they haven't yet. The McMoores, the Hawkins, the Steens, those guys are going to be needed, but none of those guys have done anything yet. Not really.
I've got about 30 seconds left. Dusty Orleans wants to know your favorite Smokey and the Bandit movie.
The first one.
All right. Tell people where they can find your work online, where they can find you on Twitter.
Man, hook up with me on Twitter at CheapSeatsBass, and you can find me online, WNWS.com, and if you're in Jackson, Tennessee, at 101.5.
He's Seabass. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for listening to the Vandy Sports Podcast. Should have one more on Friday, so stay tuned for that.